between 1960 and 2000. The death penalty, however, was not applied in Tennessee. The death penalty was reinstated there in 1975, but executions did not resume until 2000, with the lethal injection that had become a legal method of execution at the end of this period. However, those sentenced to death before January 1, 1999 can request to be executed in the electric chair. Faced with difficulties in acquiring the drugs needed for lethal injections, Tennessee law was amended in 2014 to once more permit electrocution as a backup method. In case of any problems with acquiring the drugs needed for lethal injections, or in the extreme case that lethal injection becomes impractical or can no longer be performed. As of September 2024, 45 condemned prisoners are incarcerated on the state's death row. The Tennessee Supreme Court sets execution dates. The governor alone decides whether to grant or deny clemency. The Tennessee Board of Probation and Parole makes a recommendation in each case, but the governor is not required to follow the board's recommendation. Executions take place at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville at 10 a.m. The time was 1 a.m. until 2009, 10 a.m. from 2009 to 2018, and 7 p.m. from 2018 to 2025. Tennessee has carried out 14 executions since the reinstatement of the death penalty. 1 in 2000 under Governor Don Sundquist, 5 from 2006 to 2009 under Governor Phil Bredesen, 3 during the final months of Bill Haslam's second term, including Edmund Zagorski, and 5 so far under Bill Lee. Lee has placed an indefinite stay in the issuing of death warrants due to systemic issues with the application of the state's execution protocol. The first execution during Bredesen's governorship was that of Sedley Alley, sentenced to death for the rape, torture and murder of 19-year-old U.S. Marine Corps Lance Corporal Suzanne Marie Collins. Her parents were notable advocates of expediting the death penalty appeal process. Another condemned inmate, Stephen Ray Thacker, was sentenced to death for a tow truck driver's murder in Tennessee, but ultimately executed in Oklahoma for a separate rape murder in that state. Cecil J. Johnson, Jr., was born August 29, 1956, in Maury County. He had dropped out in the 9th grade before getting his get in prison in 1987. He was the oldest of 10 children. At 21, Johnson was married and had a child. He worked at Vanderbilt University as dishwasher and cook at the time of his arrest. On July 5, 1980, Bob Bell's Market on 12th Avenue South in Nashville, Tennessee was robbed by an armed gunman around 9:45 p.m. In the store at the time of the robbery were Bob Bell, Jr., his son Bobby, and Louis Smith, an acquaintance of Bob's. Bobby Bell was helping at the cash register, and Smith was working at the store repairing a boat motor for Bob Bell. Cecil Johnson pointed a gun at Bell and ordered him and Smith behind the register where Bobby Bell stood. While Johnson and his captives were behind the counter, a woman and 2 children entered the market. Johnson concealed his gun and told his captives to act naturally and to wait on the customers. As soon as the customers left, Johnson ordered Bobby Bell to fill a bag with money from the cash register. Bobby obeyed. Johnson then searched Smith and Bell, taking Smith's billfold. At that moment, Charles House stepped into the market and was ordered out by Johnson. House obeyed. Almost immediately thereafter, Johnson began shooting his captives. Bobby Bell was shot first and killed. Smith threw himself on top of Bobby to protect him from further harm, and was himself shot in the throat and hand. Johnson then walked toward Bob Bell, who was on the floor behind the counter, pointed the gun at Bell's head and pulled the trigger. Fortunately, Bell threw up his hands and the bullet hit him in the wrist, breaking it. Johnson ran from the market. Bell got a shotgun from under the store counter, ready to chase Johnson, then heard 2 gunshots outside the market. He looked toward the front of the store and saw Johnson standing beside an automobile parked at the entrance. Bell chased after Johnson. As he passed the automobile, he saw that a cab driver and his passenger had been shot. The passenger was later identified as Charles House, the customer who had entered the market only moments before Johnson began shooting his captives and who was acquainted with Johnson. Both the cab driver, James E. Moore, and Charles House died from a gunshot wound. Information Bell gave to police officers immediately after the robbery led to Johnson's arrest on July 6, 1980. At trial, both Bell and Lewis Smith identified Johnson as the perpetrator of the crimes. In addition, Deborah Smith, the customer who entered the market during the commission of the robbery, identified Johnson as having been behind the counter with Bell, Bobby Bell, and Lewis Smith. Johnson was also connected to the crimes by Victor Davis, a friend who had spent most of July 5, 1980, in the company of Johnson. Johnson discarded the gun, which Davis later retrieved and sold the following day for $40. Davis further testified that after he picked up Johnson, they drove directly to Johnson's father's house, arriving shortly after 10 midnight there. In the presence of Johnson's father, Johnson took money from the sack, counted approximately $200, and gave $40 of this money to Davis. According to Davis, Johnson told his father that he and Davis had been gambling and that gambling was the source of the money. During the course of the investigation, Davis made statements to the prosecution and defense that provided Johnson with an alibi. In essence, Davis said that he and Johnson were together continuously from roughly 3:30 p.m. on July 5 until approximately midnight, and that at no time did they visit Bell's Market. However, the week before the trial, and after he was arrested on unrelated charges of carrying a deadly weapon and public drunkenness, Davis made a statement to the prosecution incriminating Johnson. At trial, Davis, who was promised immunity from prosecution for any involvement in the crimes committed at Bell's Market, confirmed his statements incriminating Johnson. According to Davis's testimony, he and Johnson left Franklin, Tennessee, at approximately 9:25 p.m. on July 5 and arrived in Nashville in the vicinity of Bell's Market shortly before 10 midnight. Johnson then left Davis's automobile after stating that he was going to rob Bell and was going to try not to leave any witnesses. Davis testified that he next saw Johnson some 5 minutes later near Johnson's father's house, which was roughly a block from Bell's Market. Davis stated that Johnson was carrying a sack and pistol and, when he entered Davis's automobile, Johnson said, "I didn't mean to shoot that boy." Johnson testified on his own behalf and denied being in Bell's Market on July 5, 1980. His testimony as to the events of the day was largely in accord with that of Victor Davis, except for the time just before 10 midnight. Johnson testified that he never left Davis's automobile on the trip from Franklin to Johnson's father's house in Nashville and that he arrived at his father's house shortly before 10 midnight. Johnson's father testified that Johnson arrived a few minutes before 10 o'clock, just before the 10 p.m. news began. After hearing all the evidence, a Tennessee jury convicted Johnson of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of assault with intent to commit murder, and 2 counts of armed robbery. The jury recommended that Johnson be sentenced to death on each count of first-degree murder and to consecutive life sentences on each of the remaining counts. The trial court accepted this recommendation and imposed the death penalty. Johnson also murdered fellow death row inmate Laren Williams in 1985. A group of condemned convicts assaulted Williams during an exercise period. Williams had been sentenced to death for the murders of a police officer and a priest. On December 2, 2009, Cecil J. Johnson Jr. was executed by lethal injection in Tennessee. Johnson, the sixth person in the state to be executed since 1960, was pronounced dead after a lethal injection was given at 1 a.m. Still, last-ditch efforts for clemency and motions to stop the execution failed. The Tennessee Supreme Court had denied a request for a stay of execution that was filed by the Reconciliation Ministries. Johnson refused a final meal. He met with his spiritual advisor, Reverend James Thomas, of the Jefferson Street Missionary Baptist Church. Meanwhile, a service was held in opposition to the death penalty at Hobson United Methodist Church in East Nashville, where 60 people gathered. Before his death, Nashville's federal court granted a temporary restraining order stopping Johnson's autopsy, pending further review by the court. A hearing was set for 1 p.m. Johnson claimed an autopsy after the execution would be against his religious beliefs and would amount to desecration. Johnson, 53, was forgiven by his 29-year-old son serving prison time in West Tennessee. James Johnson, serving 23 years for aggravated assault and aggravated robbery, sent his father a message with Riverbend maximum security prison warden Ricky Bell. "Tell him I love him and forgive him for not being there," Johnson's son said in the message. "And tell him he is not the reason why I am in prison." 13 minutes after the lethal injection began, Cecil Johnson was officially declared dead at 1:34 a.m. Bob Bell Sr. and Moore's brother witnessed the execution in a separate room from Johnson's family, Carter said. They did not speak to the media after the execution. When the blinds to the execution room were lifted, Johnson lay strapped to a gurney with medical tubes strapped to his skin. He mouthed "I love you" to his wife, 2 brothers and daughter, and was asked whether he had any final words. "You all stay strong, and keep trusting in the Lord," he said. After the warden said proceed, daughter Dongala Johnson, 30, turned away and covered her ears as her father took 2 deep breaths, fell asleep and began to snore. She tried to leave the witness room, but was told by a guard that she couldn't until the warden announced the time of death. After the execution, wife Sarah Johnson said, "You didn't put away an evil man. You put away a holy man." Cecil didn't want anyone to have pity, said brother David Johnson. He already gave himself to the Lord. A few dozen empty death penalty protesters gathered in a field outside the prison. "If we're not here, who is going to know that there are people who don't want this to happen?" said Monica Scarlett, 50, a graduate student in social work. Thank you for watching Death Row.